Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at some really interesting source material. It tackles a critical moment in U.S. economic policy.
And it's framed, maybe surprisingly, by this growing rift between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Figures you might have thought, were more aligned previously.
Exactly. We've got this article digging into their conflict, specifically around fiscal strategy and, well, the potential fallout from some recent political moves.
That's right. So our goal here is to unpack the main points from this analysis, really get a handle on the different views presented,
Yeah.
and explore what it all could mean for the U.S. economy and, really importantly, for the dollar's global standing.
And based on this material, you should probably expect some, well, unexpected political pairings and ripple effects that go way beyond the usual budget talk.
Definitely.
Okay, let's dive in. The piece starts by outlining this shift between Trump and Musk. They seem, on the same page initially, deregulation, innovation, that sort of thing.
But now there's this sharp split described, especially on how the country manages its finances, fiscal strategy.
So the article details Trump's budget plan as it's been proposed. We're talking, what, trillions in new spending?
Trillions, yeah. And maybe the biggest thing highlighted is the proposal to just remove the debt ceiling altogether.
Right. And Musk's reaction to that, according to the source.
Pretty blunt. He's quoted calling it the big, beautiful bankruptcy bill.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. He's basically warning quite strongly that this move will, massively increase the debt, destabilize the dollar.
And undermine innovation, he thinks.
And potentially harm the very environment needed for innovation. That's how the analysis positions his argument, Musk advocating for restraint against Trump's more expansionary focus.
So it positions Musk for financial restraint, sort of standing against what the article presents as Trump's focus on expansionary spending, maybe overlooking longer-term risks.
That's the dynamic presented, yes. A focus perhaps more on short-term goals versus long-term stability.
Okay, so Trump pushing for big spending, no debt ceiling, Musk is sounding the alarm, but then the source throws in this curveball.
Ah, the unlikely alliance.
Yeah, between Trump and progressive Senator Elizabeth Warren, specifically on the debt ceiling.
It does sound odd at first glance, doesn't it? But the article explains they both want the debt ceiling gone.
Completely. But for different reasons, right?
Yeah.
The source digs into that.
Right. The analysis suggests Trump wants, well, total freedom fiscally, unrestricted ability to spend without those limits.
While Senator Warren's goal, as described, is more about ending the political fighting, taking that whole debt ceiling battle off the table.
Exactly. Removing it as a point of political brinkmanship that we see crop up time and again.
So, okay, different motivations.
Yep.
But the source says the result is the same. Removing borrowing limits, which effectively means, what, unlimited federal debt?
Essentially, yeah. Allowing potentially unlimited federal debt and spending. And the article talks about the consequences.
What does it say are the immediate effects?
Immediately, the Treasury could issue maybe trillions in new bonds to cover old bills, fund new programs, you name it.
But the long-term risk, that's the bigger concern flagged here.
That's the core issue emphasized, yeah. The risk of seriously damaging trust in the U.S. dollar, its stability, its place in the world economy.
Because if there's no limit, the government needs to borrow huge amounts. And this leads to what the source calls a monetary domino effect.
Right. You remove the ceiling, the Treasury suddenly needs to sell a massive amount of bonds to fund everything.
And the problem, highlighted in the article, is that global demand for these bonds, it might be weakening.
It seems to be faltering, yes.
Yeah.
There might not be enough buyers out there, the traditional ones, to absorb such a huge volume.
So if the usual suspects aren't buying, who steps in? Who does the analysis point to?
Well, this is where the Federal Reserve potentially enters the picture, according to the article, acting as the buyer of last resort.
The Fed buys the government's debt, and the piece explains what happens then.
It does. It calls this monetizing the debt, effectively. When
Yep.
the Fed buys those bonds, it pushes liquidity into the system.
It's like the U.S. borrowing from itself using the central bank. Is that the idea?
That's a common way to describe it, yeah. The Fed acts as the intermediary.
And the article makes a point to say this isn't literally printing physical money.
No, not like running printing presses. But the effect is described as being basically the same.
How so?
Well, the analysis explains you end up with more dollars circulating in the economy, and that inherently dilutes the value, the purchasing power of all the dollars already out there.
And that dilution, that's the inflation trigger, right, as the article lays it out.
Directly. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services. Prices go up. That's the connection made.
Which then takes us into the next section of the analysis, these ripple effects of inflation, how it creates winners and losers.
Yeah, it argues it disproportionately helps people who own assets and hurts consumers, particularly those without assets.
Okay, let's break that down. The winner's side, according to the material. First, gold.
Yeah, the piece notes gold often surges when people worry about currency stability or inflation. It's that classic hedge, right, against losing purchasing power.
Makes sense. And real estate.
Same idea. Values tend to climb. Good if you own property already, acts as a hedge. But it makes it much harder for people trying to buy their first home.
And interestingly, the analysis specifically mentions Bitcoin here.
It does. It highlights Bitcoin gaining more, let's say, institutional traction as a finite, decentralized alternative.
Different from government money.
Exactly. And the piece gives concrete examples. Arizona, New Hampshire, thinking about holding Bitcoin in state treasuries. That's presented as a pretty big signal of a shift in thinking.
Okay, so potential winners.
Mm-hmm.
Gold holders, property owners, maybe even Bitcoin adopters.
Yeah.
What about the loser's side described in the article?
Well, the analysis points to renters, first-time home buyers. They face rising housing costs, both rent and purchase prices. It hits their cost of living hard.
And wage earners, too.
Definitely. The article really stresses that for many people earning wages, their income just doesn't keep up with how fast costs are rising. So their real purchasing power shrinks over time.
And the conclusion drawn in the source?
Is that this whole process just speeds up inequality. It widens that gap between the asset-rich and, well, everyone else.
Which puts the Federal Reserve in a really tough position. The source describes it as being caught between two bad options, basically.
Yeah, a real dilemma. Option one, raise interest rates sharply to fight inflation.
But the consequence of that?
Well, the analysis says that makes borrowing way more expensive for the government on its huge debt, which makes deficits worse. And it slams the brakes on the economy, potentially recession.
Okay, not great.
Yeah.
What's the alternative? Keep rates steady.
If they hold rates steady or low, it helps the government manage its debt payments, keeps the spending going.
Right.
But the article argues you risk letting inflation just keep climbing, maybe spiral. So the point made is, either way, there's economic pain involved. No easy answer.
And this isn't just a domestic issue, is it? The article talks about global effects.
Absolutely. The dollar's role, its dominance. It's all built on trust. Trust in the U.S. economy's stability, its fiscal responsibility.
And the risk, as this analysis sees it, is that if global investors, central banks, start seeing the U.S. as fiscally reckless, especially with this idea of no borrowing limits, well, they might start getting nervous.
Nervous enough, too.
To potentially reduce how much U.S. Treasury debt they hold, to hold fewer dollars in their reserves.
And shift that money where? What does the source suggest?
Towards assets they see as safer stores of value. That could be gold, maybe Bitcoin, like we mentioned, or even other countries' currencies.
So the dollar's dominance isn't ending overnight, but
the article argues the erosion has begun. Quietly, maybe, but steadily. The foundation is being chipped away at.
Which really brings us to the core message of this source material, doesn't it? It feels like a systemic warning. It does. If you take away the debt ceiling and don't replace it with any other rules, the piece argues there are basically no brakes left on spending.
And it makes a point about this not being just one party's issue.
Yeah, a pretty pointed observation. That willingness to increase debt isn't confined to Republicans or Democrats. The source suggests neither party has shown a strong, consistent commitment to fiscal discipline.
So the result described is this bipartisan pattern of choosing maybe short-term ease over long-term stability.
That's the characterization. And the analysis uses a really strong analogy here. It compares the whole dynamic to a Ponzi scheme.
Wow, okay. That's a powerful comparison. How does the source justify that framing?
The argument presented is that the system becomes reliant on constantly bringing in more debt just to keep functioning. More debt leads to the need for more liquidity.
The money printing effect we talked about.
Right, which then fuels more inflation, which means you need even more debt to cover the rising costs. It's a cycle.
And a prediction from that analogy
is that, like any Ponzi scheme, eventually it just becomes unsustainable. It collapses under its own weight. That's the outcome predicted if this path continues unchecked.
So, circling back to where we began, the article really seems to echo those concerns Musk was raising.
It certainly highlights the gravity. It frames this not just as some technical budget argument in D.C., but as a really fundamental generational risk.
And the analysis concludes that trust in the U.S. financial system itself is fraying.
Demonstrably fraying is the term used. And the source's closing thought is pretty stark.
What's that?
That just using beautiful rhetoric isn't going to cut it. It won't restore credibility once that fundamental trust is lost, whether it's with global markets or just regular citizens.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to think about.
For sure. And maybe the final thought from the source to leave you with is this. If, or perhaps when, an economic system built more and more on endless debt finally hits a wall, the analysis suggests those who are unprepared will be the ones who bear the brunt. It could trigger a massive shift in wealth, potentially the largest in history.